Every day, more needs, more technology available, more comfort, more products on the shelves, and every day, new questions. What is there in our fields, on our plates, in our medicines? Has the industrial era made our world toxic? Concern is growing.
Save our planet! Save our planet!
Citizens accuse industries of hiding the truth from us, and industry denies it. How can we judge? So we turn to science. We ask researchers to be the judges of these new battles for us. We demand that they step into the arena. Science as the judge. This is what makes it a target. An activity to influence, to corrupt, or to undermine.
We're living in a world where there are many people who have a vested interest in fighting information, fighting scientific evidence, and discrediting even the notion that science could provide the truth about the natural world.
They are intentionally seeking to derail science.
So we need to identify these attacks, to expose the maneuvering of those trying to stand in the way of knowledge.
And in that context, it's essential for us to understand who these people are, what they do, why they do it, and how they do it.
And we have to understand how it is that the public sometimes participates in the spreading of this deliberate ignorance. So we need to visit this landscape of manufactured ignorance.
In northern Greece, like in most of the developed world, bees are the victims of an ongoing carnage. Well known since the 1990s, this has now become a textbook case, a point from where we can begin our exploration of the manufacture of ignorance. Things always start with an enigma. In Greece, like elsewhere, experts on bees didn't understand what was happening and why.
It was a complete mystery. Why were so many bees suddenly dying?
TV news programs everywhere showed beekeepers in total disarray.
Des tapis d'abeilles retrouvés mortes à l'entrée des ruches.
Secondly, a suspect shows up. This time it was a new generation of insecticides in our fields. The latest baby of the agrochemical industry at the time.
Containing multiple active ingredients. Every Syngenta formulation is the result of years of careful investigation and thorough research by our scientists.
The moment these new products were spread on our crops, bees started dying in their millions.
Which is why, very quickly, suspicion started falling in that direction.
Thirdly, science is asked to investigate. To do so, Fani Hajina has been constantly going back and forth between her hives and her lab.
We scientists, with the help of beekeepers, must find the answer.
But looking for the truth has proven to be a game of cat and mouse. The usual task for scientists is to retreat into the calm of their labs, then explain what's being observed on the ground. We ask them to shed light on the mystery of the dying bees, just as they have explained so many other phenomena. The role of science is to highlight natural mechanisms and reach an explanation for the slightest observable fact. This is how science normally progresses, by solving more and more mysteries. And in principle, our knowledge of the world we live in increases. However, this fine principle sometimes has a few hiccups. For scientific observers, the case of the vanishing bees is emblematic of this.
With something like bees and pesticides, you should have been able to investigate it by collecting data, by following the evidence where it's taking you.
The crux of the idea is that when we find the evidence that tells us what's happening, we tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and we let the chips fall where they may. We commit, in a way, sort of, committing to accepting the truth of those findings.
But in the case of the bees, that's not exactly how things went. In the early 2000s, government expert reports showed the toxic effect of even very low doses of neonicotinoids on bees. And yet, for more than 20 years, there has been no unanimity, no consensus on the link between these pesticides and the disappearance of bees. Why are things lagging so much? You need to be a very shrewd observer to see the whole picture.
The moment the bee problem appeared, there was 4 to 5 times more research into causes not linked to pesticides. Natural pathogens like Varroa, Nosema, and different viruses, but also bad beekeeping practices, climate change, the loss of habitat, night lighting, the Asian hornet, and other invasive species like the small hive beetle. Basically, research was much more intensive in causes unlinked to pesticides than into pesticides themselves.
A quick search in a scientific study database proves it. As soon as pesticides were suspected, the number of public or private studies focusing on other possibilities skyrocketed. 2010, the veterinary authorities were confused.
Il n'y a pas de conclusion, ni dans un sens ni dans l'autre. On ne peut pas conclure. Je ne peux pas le faire. Et je pense que personne aujourd'hui ne peut le faire.
The more studies there were, the less beekeepers could make sense of it all. It seems like a paradox until you look back to an older case.
When you see a flourishing of new studies emerge in any particular area, a little bit ironically, it creates the appearance of being dedicated to pursuing the truth. But it takes me directly back to the case of big tobacco.
It's what's up front that counts. And up front ahead of the filter.
To understand, we need to go back to the 1950s, a time when tobacco was treated with total recklessness.
Filter blend means fine tobaccos for the best taste yet.
But this recklessness wouldn't last.
What does this product contain?
In December 1953, the bad news broke. Researchers had just provoked cancer in mice by painting them with tar from cigarettes. After this discovery, war broke out.
The tobacco companies had a real crisis because they can't contest the evidence and say it's wrong. They can just say, we don't know. And so the leaders of all the major cigarette companies got together in New York City.
We now know that a meeting took place at the Plaza Hotel in New York in December between the bosses of the 7 major manufacturers, collectively known as Big Tobacco. Imagine the scene.
Gentlemen, let's get right to the heart of the matter.
The meeting would go down in the annals of ignorance.
It is a challenge to every one of us. And we are all in this together, unified.
Confronted with scientific progress, the cigarette manufacturers came up with a plan.
Yes.
They launched this campaign in which they said, you know, we're aware of this science, we think there are problems with it, and it's a matter of deep concern to us.
Now we are beginning a campaign to spell out that basic point, so that no one will fail to get it.
They decided to make a public statement.
We are pledging aid and assistance to the research effort into all phases of tobacco use and health. For this purpose, we are establishing a joint tobacco industry group, the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
Good statement. Yes.
The press published the declaration, Tobacco Industry to Start Scientific Research.
Believe me, friends, Chesterfield has for your smoking pleasure and protection every advantage known to modern science.
Chesterfield gives you scientific facts. The opening of a centre of research on tobacco didn't aim to further knowledge, but to produce knowledge that would disprove established facts. So they were using scientific methods to refute established science.
It's really using science against itself.
The explicit use of science against science, I think, does represent a kind of watershed to systematically fund scientific research in order to undermine science, effectively fighting fire with fire. That's a watershed moment.
So after they decided this, how did they operationalize it? One of the things that tobacco companies funded a lot of was what I call distracting research.
The labs backed by the cigarette manufacturers defined research projects known as special projects, or SPs, a whole arsenal for diverting science. They researched, for example, lung cancer in non-smokers. They searched for links to habitat, working conditions, personal habits. They experimented on rabbits to see if lung cancer could be caused by toxins or viruses. Big Tobacco thus generously financed hundreds of research projects. Some of these projects turned out to be very useful, such as research into the precursors of cardiovascular disease, but others were totally wacky. Can egg yolk or tomato juice on the skin lead to tumors? What's the link between lung cancer and baldness? Or between this same cancer and the month of birth? If you were born in March, claimed one study, you were more at risk.
The idea is to say there are all kinds of causes. It is to spread ignorance by clouding the issue with a multitude of data.
A convincing strategy, because lung cancer can probably be explained by a combination of factors. Identifying the different risk factors is normal in science. Multiplying avenues of research seems totally legitimate. But it can also be extremely handy for sowing confusion. It becomes almost impossible to prove the suspect's guilt, and that's the aim.
That's extremely well understood, and that designed the playbook for pretty much every other science denial that has followed.
This is a story about tobacco. This is a story about acid rain. This is a story about the ozone hole. This is a story about pesticides. This is a story about climate change. Neonicotinoids, bisphenol A, contraceptive pills. I mean, we have now seen this strategy used over and over and over again. It's about buying time.
And sadly, it's a winning strategy.
In the case of tobacco, it's 70 years already and it's still going.
In the case of the dying bees, the advancement of knowledge has also been deliberately slowed down.
With all that's gone on, I'd say we've wasted 20 to 30 years.
So we're talking about decades of disinformation and decades of delay.
In the meantime, the companies are still making gobs of money.
When a scientific lie has been constructed over several decades, where do the first cracks begin to appear? 40 years after the first alerts on tobacco, somewhere in the US, a humble employee performed an act that would change everything. The box he sent finally arrived in California at the University of San Francisco. On that day, Professor Glantz was in for a surprise.
On May 12, 1994, a box of documents landed in my office from an anonymous source. These were internal documents from at the very highest levels of the tobacco industry. They're senior scientists, they're senior lawyers, they're senior management, they're senior public relations people, talking very, very frankly about what they knew about the dangers of smoking.
This was an unhoped-for treasure for the professor.
It was like a new world, stumbling into a new world.
Take seats.
The leaked documents increased in number. The truth broke. The tobacco industry bosses were cornered.
Gentlemen, the recent disclosure of documents have shaken my confidence that your companies care about the truth. These documents suggest possible manipulation of scientific research by industry attorneys. If these things are true, then you should know that this kind of behavior is unacceptable and will not be allowed.
Faced with the proof, the tobacco bosses were forced to make decades of secret archives public.
And the collection, which started out a few thousand pages, is now up around 93 million pages.
These documents are now kept in the University of San Francisco archives. They contain all the details of a massive manipulation of science. The tactics deployed, the researchers recruited, and the sums of money involved. Among these documents, one internal memo from 1969 sums up on its own what the tobacco industry had decided to produce.
Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy.
The key strategy is the creation of doubt about science. Doubt is a perfect weapon. It's effective but also pernicious because doubt is legitimately part of science. In fact, it's an essential driver of science. We investigate things because we have questions about them, because we're curious, or because we doubt the existing explanation is adequate. So we need doubt in science.
The word doubt is key to science. We always say science doubts. But there are two types of science. Established science, where we no longer question that the Earth is round, or that apples fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. Galileo measured it. We can measure it again, but it won't change the result. Here there is no doubt. Doubt exists in ongoing science, in what we're studying, in proposing hypotheses. So the strategy of doubt is about saying that established, accepted science is still subject to doubts.
So what the tobacco industry did was to take a virtue and turn it into a vice.
The use of scientific method against science itself. That's what these documents revealed. These windfalls enthuse historians and whistleblowers. They have even inspired a new field of study.
How many of you before this week knew something about the history of tobacco? Yeah, most people. Okay.
Naomi Oreskes teaches her students to identify historical obstructions of science.
Questions of science, did we know? The discovery of this long history of deception has led to a new field of intellectual study, a new academic field, and it's called agnotology, and that means the study of ignorance.
Agnotology was born. Now, academics attempt to unravel the mainsprings of our ignorance, to look into what we don't know, a curious field of study.
We were laughed at first because people thought it was not academic to study the absence of knowledge, to study ignorance. But I think people are laughing a bit less now and starting to be a bit worried because we sense and they realize how pervasive the problem might be.
What prevents us from knowing? More people are asking this question, encouraging experts in ignorance to leave their universities and speak out publicly.
But over the course of this talk, I'll introduce different ways of thinking about ignorance, and particularly this phrase, strategic ignorance. We're going to ask you to think about examples in your own life of strategic ignorance.
A new understanding of ignorance is emerging. Until now, ignorance meant not knowing what we might know one day thanks to research. But now we're beginning to see that you can actively produce ignorance.
So we're now invited to look for obstacles to our knowledge, things that halt the progress of science, deliberately or not, and sometimes even what we prefer not to know. Unraveling all that is no small issue. That's why the study of ignorance, or agnotology, needs to progress methodically.
And it's a fascinating field of inquiry with contributions from psychology, sociology, history, political science, cognitive science, computer science, network science. There are lots of disciplines involved that can help us understand how ignorance is being manufactured and how we can protect ourselves against it.
This new awareness is still in its early days, but the race is on, because the strategic production of ignorance continues to be perfected. To debunk it, we must often plunge into the detail of scientific practices. Innovations regularly arrive on the market, and with them, a fair share of suspicion. Are they a threat to our health? And more importantly, at what dosage? That's the big question, the one that gives rise to the most terrible of battles. One of these battles began in this laboratory one day in 1989. Carlos Sonnenschein and Anna Soto are both biologists. For years, they have been trying to solve the mystery of cellular proliferation in cancer. Suddenly, before their very eyes, some control cells cultivated in a test tube began to proliferate for no apparent reason.
It was a real Sherlock Holmes investigation, trying to find out where it came from, because that is the first thing you have to do, identify what is the source.
They reviewed each piece of lab equipment. 4 months of suspense. And finally, they had their culprit, the centrifuge tubes. They were made of a material that should have been inert, but wasn't. The plastic used contained and dispersed a substance that acted like the hormone estrogen.
Carlos and I were very disturbed by this finding.
We thought that this was a big deal.
If you can find such a substance here, can it be elsewhere? In toys, bottles, food containers, in all the plastics that end up in the environment. And how does it affect our organism?
The big question is establishing the doses to which the public can be exposed without a major risk to our health. And that question really is the mother of all battles.
The effect of product X on health is what is studied by toxicologists. The accepted rule is centuries old. It's simple and seemingly makes good sense. The effect is proportionate to the quantity absorbed. It's true for sugar. It's true for fats. It's true for pretty much any product. According to the rules of toxicology, the dose makes the poison, which by extension means that anything below the dose isn't a poison. According to this rule, a plastic with the characteristics of a hormone that ends up in a baby's mouth shouldn't pose any problem, because the quantity of synthetic estrogen ingested is tiny. True or false? This is the crux of the battle.
An experiment was carried out at the University of Missouri by a researcher called Fred vom Saal. He was the first to carry out a controlled experiment on lab animals to try to evaluate the activity of a common plastic called bisphenol A.
This has the structure of an estrogenic drug. They are using a sex hormone to make plastic. This is insane.
For years, Professor vom Saal and his team observed mice exposed to different doses of bisphenol A. To measure the traces of the product, they explored what happens at the limits of detection using ultra-sensitive machines. And what they discovered shook the world of science.
In fact, the damage to the reproductive system was occurring at 25,000 times below what had been considered a dose that would cause no effect. We were absolutely shocked.
This was huge for several reasons. The most important being that some of these substances can have bigger effects at tiny doses than with stronger doses. And why is that important? Because regulatory toxicology tests the harmfulness of these molecules at high doses and never tests, or extremely rarely, tests the harmfulness of these molecules at the tiny doses to which humans are generally exposed.
At low dose, bisphenol A doesn't act like a typical poison. It acts as an endocrine disruptor, meaning that it disturbs our hormones, the molecules that regulate, among other things, our reproductive system. With the tiniest observable doses, it can have devastating effects. In other words, between the dose and the effect of a product, research is starting to find some very unexpected relationships. And this is shaking up the world of toxicologists.
We were rejecting their dogma.
The toxicology community have not accepted it.
They said, we reject this.
The resistance of the toxicologists was well-intentioned. It was also providential for the manufacturers of plastics.
It's not always that people intentionally want to derail science. Some people, unwittingly, through no fault of their own, can at times be pawns in other people's efforts to produce strategic ignorance.
There are many ways that ignorance is produced. Some of them are malevolent, some of them are inadvertent, some of them are well-intentioned but end up having these outcomes. And I think it's actually extremely important for us to study the broad question of how ignorance is produced, because not everyone who produces ignorance is necessarily evil, but some of these people are.
The plastics industry gives financial backing to alternative research, thanks to which its spokespeople can proclaim year after year that low doses are without danger.
More than 100 independent studies have shown that real-life exposure to BPA is about 1,000 times below the safe intake limit set by...
I'm saying one thing, industry is saying another, and there needed to be explanations of how the difference was occurring.
Vom Sau wanted to understand. He collected studies published on the subject, and as a true agnotologist, he started investigating to find out why their conclusions diverged.
During that time, I didn't get a lot of sleep. I drank a lot of coffee. Yes.
His conclusion: 93% of public studies ascertained the harmful effects of bisphenol A at very weak doses, whereas none of the studies financed by the industry did. He finally grasped the major reason for this difference. Much better than a lie, a genuine conjuring trick in the laboratories.
They put a lot of time and effort into figuring out, how do we do a study that shows no effects of this chemical?
How do you go about it? First, you find the right animal model. That starts with these catalogs of laboratory mice and rats. You can choose them according to their biological parameters. You order them tailor-made, customized to the needs of the experiment you plan to carry out. Then they're dispatched directly to your lab.
The industry groups were using a very strange animal to try to show that bisphenol A caused no harm.
If you are interested in showing that bisphenol A is not estrogenic, you would select a strain of rat in which bisphenol A does not become an estrogenic compound.
So you have to be very careful about the model you choose, because you can choose the wrong model. And you can choose the wrong model because you don't know, or you can choose the model because you know too well.
How can you do this?
Tailor-made rats to prove the innocence of bisphenol A. Another success trick by the illusionists of science. Thus, the most insidious offensives are hidden in the details, such as in the research protocols. This group of rules, so tricky to put in place, which guarantee the seriousness of a study. It only takes a corrupted protocol or a broken rule to shove scientific progress off the rails.
What's at stake here is evidence-based policymaking. Whether policy is based on the best available evidence or whether policy is designed to satisfy a particular industry in their pursuit of profit.
The manufacturers of ignorance have a target: the assemblies and parliaments of our democracies, which will ban or authorize a suspect product.
Nous allons passer au vote de cette proposition de loi.
The moment we give up on evidence-based policymaking, we've given up on democracy.
Il peut être en verre ou en plastique, mais désormais le biberon, c'est sans bisphénol A.
On that day, the French Parliament banned the guilty baby bottles. But the ban concerns one single endocrine disruptor, present in one single product, sold in one single country. A small victory 20 years after the first alarm bells rang. A serious public health problem therefore continues to be covered up. Among the population, we're seeing a sharp increase in metabolic troubles, obesity, diabetes, hormone-dependent cancers, neurobehavioral disorders, and infertility. In this explosion of cases, endocrine disruptors are the prime suspects, because everybody's organism is impregnated with them. Meanwhile, the defenders of the plastics industry continue to sow doubt.
The presence of a chemical in your body does not mean it's harmful.
Such affirmations are spread on the internet.
The more effect it's going to have.
Yes, BPA is safe.
On our screens, many organizations with no apparent links to the industry talk about bisphenol A, sources of energy, the dying out of bees, the climate, food supplements, animal well-being, shale oil, and so on. On the internet, made-to-measure science is spreading. And the target here is the general public, us and our opinions. Because today, to say whether we're pro or anti-diesel, homeopathy, or vaping, we click on like, we tweet, we retweet. This is now public opinion. Anonymous yet global, social networks seem to be the ideal forum for misleading all debate. In this building, people keep an eye on this global discussion. The Institut des Systèmes Complexes is home to mathematicians, IT experts, and data specialists. They develop tools to analyze the permanent conversation on social networks. Over 3 months, David Chavalarias and his team have analyzed 20 million posts on the climate. They all come from Twitter and spread across the globe.
Species are likely to disappear soon.
Who is talking to whom? And how do the climate skeptics and their adversaries duel over this virtual space? The team has put together a system with which we can visualize this giant controversy. A dot is one person. A line between two people means that one of them has passed on the other's post. The more we pass on each other's posts, the closer the dots get. And before their eyes, the world's biggest scientific debate appears.
Here we have all the Twitter accounts that form the community of climate skeptics. You can see that this community is very distinct in terms of sharing the information from the other community, made up of those who agree on the climate consensus. That's 140,000 accounts. That's a lot of people.
Once the debate is rendered observable,
look,
what can we conclude?
This is interesting. On the skeptic side, the core is always active. These people never stop tweeting.
There are fewer of them, but they're more active, which means they're trying to counterbalance the debate.
Exactly. They're overactive. Some accounts have 100,000, 200,000 tweets. In 10 years, that's incredible. So this is how they're colonizing Twitter. It's crazy.
A hardcore spreading its arguments in astronomical quantities. That's the asset of the climate skeptics in this battle for territory. Enough to keep the community alive despite the gathering evidence. For the almost unanimous scientific community, global warming is unequivocal and the impact of man is evident. This consensus, however, doesn't impose itself on the web.
We see that very regularly, scientific facts prove the climate skeptics' theories wrong, which is potentially dangerous for this community because they can lose members over it. So there's a kind of inoculative reaction. For 2 or 3 days, they'll inundate the social networks with alternative facts and will keep their visibility in a globalized environment. Without social networks, communities of this size wouldn't be able to survive the facts, which so clearly disprove their beliefs.
Who propagates climate-skeptical thought, and why? Let's go back through the posts. Take, for example, this Twitter account called Heartland Institute. What is there behind this dot? The Heartland Institute is this house set off a quiet street. Its offices are completely calm. And yet, we're at one of the most reputed think tanks in the world. Here, they produce tweets, but also articles, conferences, and books. The Heartland Institute has its expert on climate matters and its director of communication. Neither of them is a scientist, which doesn't prevent this organization from massively spreading contrarian science on the climate.
The best scientific evidence indicates there's no climate crisis. In fact, it's pretty strong that we're not facing one.
I mean, the Heartland Institute is globally known for our work with scientists who are skeptical that humans are causing a climate crisis. We are actually hated probably by a lot of people around the world for that, because we're well known for that.
When the climate skeptic community meets up, the Heartland Institute always tops the bill. As the sponsor or co-sponsor of conferences like this one in Munich, Germany.
And I encourage you to share the truth and share ways of finding the truth with people, because that is the only way that the scientific method will prevail. Sound science and truth will win out.
Who are the researchers who continue to doubt despite the consensus? Are they skeptics because they're more conscientious, more rigorous than the others?
What rational basis is there for saying that a little bit of warmer weather would be a bad thing? There is no basis.
Are they paid by the oil industry to deny the effects of CO2 on the climate?
We do not face a catastrophe of rising sea level.
It's customary to look for shared interests between climate skeptics and the industry. But according to Naomi Oreskes, the best explanation lies elsewhere. As a historian, she has studied the career paths of the first scientists to express doubts about climate change, some eminent physicists.
And what we found by reading their papers, reading their diaries, reading their letters to each other, that the motivation was not primarily money. It was ideological. These men had been very prominent in the Cold War, and they believed very deeply, and I think sincerely and authentically, in the communist threat.
At the time, the main battle between the Soviet Union and the United States was the conquest of space.
America's leadership on Earth demands leadership in space.
American physicists were mobilized to build a military and space program. Science in the service of ideology.
And they believed that the work they had done as scientists had helped to contain the communist threat and protect American democracy.
Then the communist world collapsed. Victory for America, and for the physicists engaged in the crusade for its supremacy. And yet, they didn't lay down their weapons. Soon after, a conference was held in Washington. Among the speakers was Fred Singer, a space race pioneer. However, he wasn't there to talk about rockets, but about the climate.
First, you must understand that there is no real scientific support for the so-called global greenhouse warming.
When the Cold War ended, they seemed to need a new enemy. And the new enemy they found was environmentalism, which they interpreted as a kind of Reds under the bed.
What do they want? What is the real goal? The real goal is political control of the economy.
They're using the so-called climate crisis caused by man as an excuse to do what they've always wanted to do.
This is about remaking and reforming society, and it's in a socialist image.
So the Heartland Institute stands in front of them and says no.
In the wake of the scientists who had embraced an ideology, the Heartland Institute is clearly the heir of an era.
I'm a kid of the Cold War, right? Freedom and liberty is precious.
And now you have something like climate change that actually threatens the existence of life on Earth. And because it's so fundamental, it requires a significant intervention. And that's what they can't accept.
Why? Well, because if you're emotionally invested in free markets, then climate change is a serious emotional threat, because dealing with it means we have to change our approach to business. And for some people, that is extremely challenging.
It entails giving up airplane travel. It entails giving up combustion automobiles.
By the way, that means destroying 1/4 of your cars, destroying 1/4 of your power plants.
I think our way of life is at risk.
And the scientific reason just isn't there.
Our way of life, our frenzied consumption, our production methods. These are what we must change if science concludes that humans are responsible for global warming, which is unthinkable to some. Science, sure, but not the science that threatens our beliefs and values. Not if it stops us from living happy and carefree lives. And what if, inside of us, we also had a need not to know? Psychologists have clearly identified the individual cognitive mechanisms through which, unbeknownst to us, we construct our beliefs and limit our own knowledge by turning our brain into a small factory of ignorance. A professor of psychology at Bristol University in the United Kingdom, Stefan Lewandowski explores the complex relationships that we have with science. He wonders how to deal with a scientific consensus that doesn't suit us.
If people are threatened by the science, but they recognize that all the scientists, nearly all the scientists, agree on that, then they're put into the situation of conflict or cognitive dissonance. What am I going to do with my beliefs when all the scientists agree that, my beliefs are under threat?
Hi, you must be Ellie. I'm Steve Lewandowski. Welcome to the experiment. Thanks for coming. Let me show you.
The professor is carrying out an experiment. He receives subjects willing to take part.
Thanks for coming. Let me show you the lab. It's right here. Seat in front of the computer, please. So what I want you to do is just read through that, and then click at the bottom when you're ready to proceed.
With each of them, he firstly wants to assess their behavior when confronted with scientific issues, their political leanings, and their appetite, or not, for conspiracy theories. To do so, he exposes each subject to dozens of affirmations, and they say whether or not they agree.
There is no such thing as facts anymore.
Secret organizations can manipulate people psychologically.
Socialism has many advantages over capitalism. Out of 100 climate scientists, how many do you think believe that CO2 emissions cause climate change?
So this is where we now analyze the data from the experiment in real time. And what you see on
the results show a correlation between their opinions on scientific issues, their political beliefs, and the size of their appetite for conspiracy theories.
And accepting that the consensus. When asked to explain why there is a scientific consensus, they will resort to conspiracies whenever the scientific consensus is in conflict with their worldviews. On vaccinations, climate change, to explain away the scientific consensus, it is extremely helpful to just basically say, well, the scientists are all engaged in groupthink, or they're pursuing a political agenda. They're all sort of in a little bit of a conspiracy. The moment I do that, I can cling to my beliefs and I can dismiss the scientific consensus. What is really striking here is that for climate change, it matters a great deal, because the more conservative people are, the more they think that scientists are conspiring to produce a consensus.
Is scientific truth threatening your vision of the world? Then adopt a theory that says that scientists are all conniving against the truth.
What do they want? What is the real goal?
They're using so-called climate crisis as an excuse.
In many scientific subjects, conspiracy theories reign, and each person proclaims their own theory.
The coronavirus, a bioengineered virus, contains nanoparticles that can be activated on a time-phased arrangement by 5G.
Et le vaccin et les nanoparticules sont donc injectés simultanément dans votre corps.
Cette pandémie est quelque chose qui a été organisé.
Le crime parfait contre l'humanité.
And we have a cure. They just don't want to give it out.
Rumors and counter-rumors abound. Some denounce scientific plots. Others denounce those who denounce.
Fake news.
Share this. I love you, vegans.
On the networks, it's one side against the other. Have these confrontations supplanted the slow, meticulous approach of science? Has it become to each their own truth?
You know, if I take this pencil and drop it, we have gravity. Okay, that's not a matter of opinion.
Whatever our beliefs, we can't ignore reality. The victims of climate change. The victims of fine particle pollution. Or those of infectious diseases in places where we've stopped vaccinating. These faces are a reminder that we cannot ignore scientific truth without consequences. Facts always impose themselves in the end. And in spite of everything, our knowledge increases, gradually building up, in one way or another, through the ages. A few centuries ago, you had to be a madman to go against common belief and state that the sun and stars don't turn around us, but that the earth turns round and round like a spinning top. Those who first tried to prove this paid dearly. The works of Copernicus were banned, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for life, and their research crashed headfirst into a major presupposition of their day.
You must never forget that science is always embedded in society, so the overall social context always imposes limits on science.
300 years ago, new scientific developments had to face off against the church. Today, it's really the market that has assumed the role of the church. The market has become that authority that is hard to challenge.
Another time, another setting. What makes the world go round today is the economy. When the law of the market replaces that of the church, what new limits will be imposed on science? Will this new face-off decide which research is accepted? Of course, there are cases of the researcher caught in a conflict of interests. The scientist who ceases to remain objective because he's influenced by his financial backing. But the grip of the economy on science far outweighs these individual cases. What impact the laws of the market have on research can only be grasped if we look at the big picture.
The current framework within which science is done hugely influences which science we do.
The market economy frames science in a way that values and privileges science that can be monetized, that is lucrative.
Researchers must generate money and find it. And so, science is turned into a marketplace where everyone is trying to attract attention.
Labs are basically competing. They have to highlight their specificities and come up with fashionable keywords. In the early 2000s, the magic word was genomic. If you said you worked in genomes, which would vastly influence medicine, you were given millions of dollars. So in 2000, the researcher had to use the word genomic. In 2010, it was nanotechnologies. In 2020, it's artificial intelligence.
Okay, Sophia, I think you're ready.
Current competition is pointing science in a certain direction.
They upgraded my mind a bit. My artificial intelligence. This is too cool. I can walk.
And in the meantime, there are a whole host of unknown fields set aside to fallow.
Less fashionable or less profitable in the short term, certain scientific fields have been deserted.
Some researchers have identified what they call the problem of undone science. Now, that's science that's simply left uninvestigated because there's little commercial imperative in studying it.
Undone science, science that simply isn't done. The experiment never carried out, the lab that never opened. The epidemiological study that doesn't exist because it was never financed. The scientific books never written. The medical thesis never published. These are the vast territories of ignorance, which we don't explore because they don't earn, because we prefer not to know, or because we never even imagined them. Our need to know is limitless, and our wonder at science permanent. But we also see science under threat, a virus spreading and scientific denial spreading with it.
COVID-19 is not an issue.
It's not that lethal.
And it's not an issue for many doctors.
Controversies multiply and hinder our understanding.
Fear, fear, fear. Go and get some
miracle cures appear.
or Schweppes tonic water. Let me tell you this again. Quinine and or Schweppes tonic water.
The coronavirus, you know that, right? Coronavirus.
Biased beliefs enter minds.
This is their new hoax.
We can see the workings of this manufacture of ignorance, which the pioneers of agnotology methodically dismantle for us.
And so I guess one question we could talk about is, why does that work? I mean, on some
They speak at the world's most prestigious universities, and they're now listened to on forums, at roundtables, in the media.
So that scientists can carry out research.
And more at parliamentary commissions and inquiries.
My testimony is based on 15 years of research on the history of climate science.
There's still only a few. But for us, the general public, they're a new force we can count on. They're developing tools and methods, and they're shedding light on ways to protect a common asset, science and its meticulous progress.